Welcome to the Global E-commerce Leaders Podcast. I'm Michael LeBlanc.
And I am Jim Okamura.
And snap, it's October. A busy time for the retail industry, our community, you and me, the global trade landscape. What's going on, Jim? It's been a little while since we've talked on the mic. You and I have talked frequently, but how was your summer? And we're going to get into what you've been hearing from the community and the industry and all that great stuff. So it's great to be back on the mic with you.
Yeah, it is great to be back, Michael, and it is good to get caught up. It's obviously been a very big year in global trade, you could say, and very interesting. I think certainly the word of the year has been uncertainty, as we have spent a lot of time talking to our Global E-commerce Leaders Forum community and hearing from them. What's happening in this new world of tariffs and so on. So we'll dive into more of that, shortly. But it has been a very busy summer, as I have been speaking at a number of different association events. In some part, reaching out to adjacent industries, such as the global translators community, the Globalization and Localization Association had me speak at one of their events, and more recently, I was giving a speech on global e-commerce and the strategic options for brands at the Parcel Forum at the invitation of the International Mailers Advisory Group, or IMAG. Shout out to Kate Muth, the executive director, and to our friend AJ Hernandez at Sky Postal, who introduced me to Kate, earlier this year. So it's been great to kind of get out there and just see a lot of familiar faces, but also talk to different groups who have clearly a big stake in global e-commerce and where it's going, and kind of get their perspective, in addition to those who have been very actively involved within our GELF community.
Well, we've got some big news that we'll get to later in the pod about what we're doing in terms of bringing the community together. But the big news was based on a lot of discussions and insights over the summer. I mean, we kicked off the podcast back season 4 back in April, saying, "Yep, the community still was very interested in being a community, so to speak," and the uncertainty was just beginning. I mean, rolling up, I guess, the end of de minimis. We'll talk about that. One of the most important milestones that just happened, a consequence, so to speak, of overall trade policy. But over the course of the summer, you've mentioned a couple of events you're at, including you were at Shoptalk as well. Do you continue to hear in all of this that there is a role for our community and for events, particularly as an outcrop of the community? Do you still hear that there's a demand for that? I would think in these uncertain times that business models are changing, that there would be a equal to or greater demand for the content that we can bring the community and the community coming together. Is that what you've been hearing?
Absolutely. It's been nothing short of amazing for us to just hear the feedback we have been getting from the broader GELF community, as we've had the chance to talk to a lot of, the senior executives who have been quite heavily involved, over the years. And certainly that has given us, great encouragement to keep moving forward and to rethink, what is, GELF's role within, this community. But, as, I talked to one chief commercial officer for a very large apparel brand, recently. He really talked about what are the goals of GELF? How can, GELF really help brands of all sizes really expand their business, globally. We talked through a lot of, how the world, is changing, and how globalization strategies, are changing, likewise. So in this, the year of uncertainty with, global trade, there's never been, ironically, a greater need for a community than right now. So that certainly has, been very exciting for us just to to kind of get that feedback, from the community and say, okay, how can we help? How can we, really serve, this diverse, group of brands and retailers and solution providers and those who are just advocates, of globalization.
You're a great veteran consultant, and as many consultants would, you probably do. You kind of are trying to find the white space for a strategy here. So, I don't want to assume that everybody is listening knows exactly what the genesis of GELF was. And then I want to, if you could share that for just a couple of minutes of how it began and its role. There's a lot of conferences out there. There's a lot of groups out there. What is it that's different about GELF? As it was constituted and as we see it going forward? What is that space in the market that we provide a unique insight to and bring a fairly unique group of people? You mentioned parcel conferences, there's supply chain conferences. What is it that GELF offers?
Yeah, let's go back a little bit to the origins of the Global E-commerce Leaders Forum. More than 10 years ago now, Scott Silverman, Kent Allen, and I, we had been hearing from, a lot of clients that international strategies were going to be the next big thing. Of course, this actually predated, the explosion of mobile development, that shortly, followed. But back in 2014, we rather innocently gathered 100 or so retail and brand executives. We got together for a full day program, and it really
wasn't that at a whiskey bar? Have I got that right?
Yeah, it was at a whiskey bar. That certainly was part of our own signature to the event. But it certainly showed us that there was a real interest in learning from each other, right? In other words, the need for community was very strong. In fact, a lot of the international VPs or leaders who were really leading that global charge were rather small teams. They would have a very kind of niche role within some of these bigger companies that clearly had more of a focus on the domestic business. So that's where we came to really realize that those who are charged with the expansion beyond our domestic borders do have this great need to again hear from each other and learn, and certainly know that they cannot tackle everything themselves. So that's really where we decided that yes, we need to again really build this community over time. And to your other question of where does GELF fit into I'd say the very busy retail conference calendar. That's been a big topic of conversation recently as we were, as you mentioned, very involved with the Shoptalk Fall Conference, here in my hometown of Chicago. And, at that same time or that same week, we saw two other, big conferences happening, NRF Europe, as well as the newly founded Retail AI Club out on the West Coast. Certainly, it was a great example of where there was a lot of events happening, and therefore, those in the retail universe, were certainly divided in terms of where they're going. So we know that it's a very busy calendar, and we also know that global commerce is still a rather niche topic, despite of its vast potential, and for all companies of all sizes these days. But it's a super interesting point, because if we just take a look at the conferences that are just in the rearview mirror now, Shoptalk, I've been to many Shoptalks. They don't really talk about global expansion. They talk about how to do retail well or e-commerce very, very well. Of course, there's lessons no matter where and how you're doing it. And then you think about, you mentioned NRF Europe that was held in Paris. Again, if you look at the agenda, it was more about how to do retail in Europe. It really wasn't really wasn't focused on bringing Americans or North Americans to Europe to figure out how to do business there. It was really brought European leaders together, and of course a few non-European leaders, just to hear what's going on in a different market. But there's very little discussion about, okay, if you want to grow outside of this market where you're sitting, where do I go to learn about that, right? I mean, this is what we continue to hear, even though
the dynamic environment is, everyone's looking for growth and more growth, and international expansion is still a very valid strategy, right?
Well, one thing that was very reinforced earlier this year when we did a lot of interviews within the GELF community, it was loosely kind of called a Future of GELF study. It was certainly one of the things we validated is that we are the only game in town, at least the U.S.-based conference and community that is 100% dedicated to international growth. And I think that was very reassuring, for us to hear from some of these international executives who said that, I consider GELF to be my event to go to. So that was really, great for us to hear. And I think, was also part of one of the other key findings, from that Future of GELF study, which was something we have been actually working on, for years now. While we have e-commerce in our name, we certainly are looking, in a sense, to drop the E and just talk about global commerce. And we have been doing so really for the past, few years, as we were really encouraged by, especially some of our bigger members, to really talk towards the many different ways that, a global brand can go to market internationally. And while, yes, DTC e-commerce and selling on marketplaces and social commerce, all the e-commerce topics that we have traditionally covered are part and parcel of, that global commerce go-to-market. There's also wholesale and strategic partnerships. How do you work with international licensees or franchisees, of your brand? How do you work with international distributors, many of whom you may have, decades-long, relationships with? So these are all, topics that, we have been, encouraged to take a more holistic view of, how brands, can go to market internationally, e-commerce, being just only part of that, picture. So that's something we're really looking forward to, really kind of going forward is, how do we think about, these different ways? And I think that's been insightful for us to hear directly from some of these, big, brand leaders in terms of what's keeping them up at night, what is challenging, their business, today and into the future.
I many of us think about, because it's so in front of us, the things that are happening in America right now around the end of de minimis and tariffs, but really this is kind of, and many of other people who would attend our events have relationships and business that moves both ways, right? Into the U.S., into North America, and outside. But really, I think we're more focused on, and tell me if I got this right, really growing outside of America. So the end of de minimis, for example, while very important for many of our members or members of the community, is less a focus as is how to grow still outside, and whether it's LATAM or Europe or Asia. Do I have that right? Is that what you're hearing as well?
Yeah, it's technically the end of the de minimis, and we'll get more into this, it has a greater impact on U.S. inbound strategies. So again, shipments that are coming from outside of the U.S. and entering the U.S. And actually one, a good example I think that you can relate to, being in Canada. Lululemon, talked recently of the impact that the end of the de minimis would have on their business. And when they're saying that, roughly 2/3 of their U.S., online orders, really flow through the Canadian headquarters, the impact, like on earnings, from the elimination of the de minimis, is obviously very significant. Right. So it's not just, the big Chinese e-commerce platforms like Temu and Shein, who still dominate the volumes, of inbound, U.S. Packages and parcels. It has an impact on a lot of, different, companies as well. Coach, the luxury brand Coach, part of the Tapestry group, also weighed in, recently on, some of the tariff impact on their, business and performance. And one of their analysts, calls, I believe last month it was, they were again, talking about the impact, to their, business, being into the hundreds of millions of dollars in terms of their profitability. Wow. I'm reading from one of their quotes. The company expects a 60-cent tariff hit to their profitability, forecast. And saying with the end of the de minimis exemption on small shipments accounting for about 1/3 of that impact. Right. So even for, what is a luxury brand or an upscale, brand like Coach. And if you're not aware of,
accessible
Coach
luxury, I think you might call it.
Yeah, accessible luxury. They have certainly been trying to appeal to some of those aspirational, customers. So not all of their products, are on the luxury end of the price, spectrum, that they do certainly, have a lot of products that would fall under that formerly $800, de minimis threshold, level. So when you hear companies, big companies like that, and kind of the hard reality of what their CFOs are saying, is the financial impact. The greater impact, again, comes back to that word of the year, uncertainty. Right. That's really what, is really affecting not only the U.S. inbound, strategies, but the U.S. outbound, strategies. Because obviously, these are two-way streets that, as, the tariffs, wars have been, happening, and negotiations have been happening country to country. Certainly, we're seeing that, go from to a number of, different countries. Mexico.
Well, we saw it here in Canada. One of our initial reactions earlier in the year was to implement reciprocal tariffs, change the math around a number of goods outside of the free trade agreement. But those have recently been rolled back. But as the members, and this is what the things we're going to be talking about, I think, as the members look to whether it's Asia or LATAM or Europe. What's it like to do business there? What does it take to expand your market there? And what does it take to win, right? This must be on the minds of the executives after they get their minds filled to the top with, how am I going to deal with my business coming into America? It feels like our GELF focus is growing outside. And then that's what you would expect mostly to talk about, as interesting it is trying to figure out what zero de minimis looks like in America. It's pretty compelling to still, is there still a there in terms of growth outside of America?
Yeah, and I think that was exactly the question I think we had earlier in the summer when I was speaking at an event tied to the LEAD conference in New York City in June. And, that was a gathering, specifically on international and cross-border strategies. And one of the things that, I was saying at that event was in our Future of GELF study, it was, again, very encouraging, for us to hear from a lot of these international leaders that despite these macro headwinds, despite, all of that uncertainty hanging over them, that wasn't changing, their mandate. They still had, this international goal to hit. And this was just yet another problem they had to solve for, right? So that resolve that, we heard from a lot of these international VPs that saying that, the strategic priority of their international growth has not changed. They just got to figure out a new way to, work within that. Right.
Let's get to the meat of the event issue, so to speak, if I can put it that way, somewhat clumsily. We talked about, and you heard that, as you thought about GELF, and I've been reflecting on this for the conferences that I help organize here, is more and more, the more generic conferences are a little harder to, if not justify, to attend, that there needs to be some real focus. And I've been thinking about that in a couple of ways. One is by subject matter. So TIC, I think GELF does a pretty clear job of articulating that. But then there's always been a range of experience of people who would attend the GELF conference. I know it myself. There'd be people who are just getting in, building a team, all the way to real expert practitioners who are looking for the, if it's not 101 international, it's 404 international. And how's that sorted out? Because when you and I have been talking, there's kind of opportunities along that spectrum. But how is that shaped out? And let's talk about dinner and 2026.
Yeah, this is again something that we've been hearing for years now. In fact, some of our advisory board members, were again quick to point this out to us that we need to broaden our topic, coverage. And one went so far as to say, well, have you thought of really developing more of an advanced track, for those, brands and retailers, who have been at international for a while. They've got, mature, well-established, partnerships and channels that they have nurtured over the years. And it is very different from them when you compare it to an earlier stage international brand, let's say, one who aspires to kind of become one of those, global leaders. But they're still kind of at the stage where they're probably looking at, simpler to execute, business models like cross-border e-commerce, which really leverages, the assets and the inventory of the domestic, business. Right. But that notion of, more of an advanced, workshop was something that, had a lot of appeal to us. And so I think, that's been, fun to kind of, just think through, what would, as we've now called it, the Global Experts Workshop, look like. And as we've talked to a lot of these same, brands that we would be inviting, to this kind of event, they have also, given it a thumbs up. They've been adding, to the topics that they would like to see, covered. I know in some recent, conversations, we've been talking through issues such as brand integrity and best practices, with international partners. How do you work with, for example, your Middle Eastern licensee, who in some cases, are a much bigger organization and company than, the U.S. brand that they are selling on behalf of, right? So how do you make sure that they are really following those same brand guidelines and staying on brand as you would, with your domestic, business? So those are, that's a great, example there. We talked about other topics such as organization design through to pricing architecture. And how do you do that internationally when clearly there is a cost structure, that is very, very, different, from the domestic, business. So these are issues, that are certainly inherent in a lot of leading global brands, international, businesses. So we're really looking forward to and stay tuned for an announcement in terms of exactly when, but we are looking at in the first quarter of next year hosting this type of a global experts, workshop where we can gather, a lot of these big brands and facilitate that conversation. But as much as anything, let them learn from each other. Right. I think, that's also something we heard, very loud and clear. It's one thing to have, talking heads on stage, talking through this as much as let's get the practitioners talking to each other in terms of, what they're doing, what's working, what's not. Right.
Well, what you're getting at is building back GELF in some ways better, but mostly different. And we're going to start. We're going to walk before we run. Which is probably good advice, good consulting advice. So we're going to host a dinner in New York City. Talk about our upcoming dinner.
Yeah, very excited to, again, gather some of the GELF community in New York. October 22nd, we are hosting a global e-commerce leaders forum dinner, and we're happy to, again, do this in cooperation, with our co-hosts, our sponsors. Both Channel Engine and Livingston International are going to be sponsoring, this dinner. And it's a really great opportunity for us to have some of these conversations with some of these same, executives on what should the GELF agenda look like for really 2026 and beyond? And I think, that's really, what I'm excited to talk to folks about. It's why I've been doing some of these advanced, interviews, just to try to, have some clear ideas in mind going into that, dinner. So, yeah, very excited to kind of, get back to in-person, gathering. So for anyone, who may be interested, please, reach out to Michael or myself, directly. We are trying to keep this, to a very targeted, group that we know will bring a lot of, their own opinions to the party. And certainly that's the plan for this working dinner.
Well, and to be clear, it's not a workshop about GELF, but we're gonna. It doesn't need to be either or. We're going to talk about the future of GELF, but we're always going to fulfill the mandate. Let's all get together and talk about what's happening in global commerce. We've got two fantastic presenting sponsors. We've got limited space for it's not a large conference buffet facility. What do you think? We've got about room for 30 executives in total? Would you say?
Yeah, we've got a lovely private room at Upland NYC. Again, one of the nicer midtown restaurants in their private room. So yeah, should be a perfect size event. And I think this kind of smaller, more intimate event is something that again we heard from a lot of companies saying they love these kinds of opportunities. Sure. That's where I think going forward, while we will get back to our bigger conferences, we also hope to kind of pepper in a lot of these kind of smaller events to again reach our broader community.
Well, we wanted, as you and I talked through it, and we wanted to make sure that while we had our eyes on 2026, that we didn't linger, that we just get people together this year. And what better way is to a dinner? Attendance for executives is complimentary, thanks to our great presenting sponsors. Of course, it's going to be people that are most interested in what we're looking to hear. So by all means, get in touch with us. Midtown, if you're in the New York area or surrounding area, it'll be a great evening, getting a bunch of folks together. Thanks so much, to our friends at Channel Engine and Livingston, buying us dinner and hosting and enabling this kind of conversation to happen. So once again, get in touch with Jim or myself. Reserve your seat while you still can. We've got a couple of weeks left, and we've already got some folks put their hands up, as one might expect. Still vibrant GELF community out there. So, Jim, that's about kind of pretty much a wrap on this episode. We wanted to get together. Speaking of the podcast, this is kind of connecting us back to our first episode. We've got some new episodes coming up with experts, so stay tuned. We'll bring that expertise and continue to bring expertise on, whether it's email. We're going to re-kick back up our email communications with some value added. Hey, here's what we think is important going out to the community. Some media around the podcast and the dinner, and then an event. As you said, the event probably definitely in Q1 would be more focused on advanced, but these are the just steps we're first taking to reconstitute and get back into the mix. So it's pretty exciting, right?
It's very exciting, and I think, just thinking of, the GELF media portfolio, but the podcast, being, I think, very central to that. I think that's very exciting, to again, invite more people in our community to share some of their expertise, because certainly we've learned over the years that it does indeed take a village, right, to successfully really, launch and execute on, global commerce, strategies. So anyone who is interested in joining us on the pod, we would welcome that as well.
Fantastic. Well, that's a great way to wrap up our time together. Thanks everybody for listening. Jim, looking forward to seeing you on October 22nd in New York City in the Big Apple. Until then, safe travels everybody, great business, and we'll talk to you again real soon.
Bye now.